Some moments follow you across the stars whether you want them to or not. Daniel Carter had learned that lesson the slow way, the kind that settles into a man after years of quiet work and long nights under artificial gravity. The hum of docking ring C vibrated through the soles of his boots as he tightened the final bolt on a worn-out coolant regulator, the metal giving off a faint smell of heated alloy and machine oil. Around him, Meridian Station moved with its usual rhythm, cargo haulers gliding past the panoramic windows, automated loaders clanking along their rails, and distant voices echoing across the wide steel corridor. It was the kind of ordinary day Daniel had grown used to after 15 years of drifting from job to job across the outer colonies. Nothing dramatic ever happened here, and he liked it that way. The station orbited a pale blue gas giant nearly 300,000 miles below, its cloud bands glowing softly in reflected starlight. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and leaned back against the maintenance rail, taking a slow sip from a dented coffee thermos that had followed him through half the systems in known space. It was quiet work, fixing things people barely noticed until they broke. Pumps, seals, temperature regulators, docking clamps. Honest work. Predictable work. The kind of life that let a man forget certain memories. But the station suddenly changed its tone. First came the vibration, subtle at first, like distant thunder rolling through the hull. Then the warning lights flickered once across the docking bay ceiling. A moment later, every conversation in the corridor faded as people turned toward the observation glass stretching across the far wall. Daniel frowned and followed their gaze. Beyond the transparent barrier, the stars began to disappear. Not because night had fallen, but because something enormous was blocking them. One ship slid silently into view, then another, and another after that, until the blackness of space filled with sleek silhouettes that gleamed like polished obsidian under the distant sun. Warships. Dozens of them. Maybe more. Each vessel stretched nearly a mile long, their curved hulls lined with pale blue energy bands that pulsed like slow heartbeats. The sight stole the air from the room. Cargo pilots froze mid-step. Dock technicians lowered their tools. Even the automated loaders seemed to pause as if the station itself had taken a breath. Daniel set his thermos down slowly. He'd spent enough time in frontier systems to recognize a fleet when he saw one, and fleets didn't appear without reason. Especially not imperial fleets. A deep tone rolled through the station speakers. Attention Meridian Station personnel. Unidentified royal convoy entering orbital perimeter. All docking operations temporarily suspended. Royal convoy. The words rippled through the crowd in nervous whispers. Then the largest ship shifted position directly outside docking ring C, its surface reflecting the station lights in smooth silver waves. A ramp extended from the vessel like a bridge between worlds. Daniel felt an odd tightening in his chest as figures began to appear at the top of the ramp. Tall silhouettes. Graceful movements. Not human. And then she stepped forward. Even from across the docking bay glass, she stood out immediately. Nearly 7 feet tall, wrapped in flowing white and silver fabric that caught the station lights like liquid moonlight. Her skin held the deep luminous blue of distant oceans, and her long silver hair drifted gently in the low-gravity breeze from the open docking seals. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Bright gold, steady and searching as they scanned the crowd. For a moment Daniel couldn't move. Something about that gaze stirred a memory buried under 10 quiet years of ordinary life. The ramp sealed against the station airlock with a soft metallic sigh. The chamber doors opened, and as the tall alien princess walked into Meridian Station surrounded by silent guards, her golden eyes locked directly onto Daniel Carter across the crowded docking floor as if she had been looking for him the entire time. Daniel Carter did not move as the airlock doors finished cycling open and the quiet sound of boots touching the station floor echoed across docking ring C. The station lighting reflected softly across the polished surface of the alien escort armor as several tall figures stepped forward in perfect formation, their movements smooth and deliberate like they had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times before. But Daniel barely noticed them. His attention stayed fixed on the woman walking at their center. Up close, she seemed even taller than he first thought, her posture calm and composed as if the crowded station around her was nothing more than a quiet hallway in her own palace. The soft silver fabric, Around her shoulders moved gently in the low-gravity airflow of the docking bay, and every step she took carried the quiet confidence of someone used to being watched. Yet her golden eyes did not wander across the crowd like the others did. They stayed locked on him. Daniel felt his chest tighten again, as if something deep in his memory was trying to surface but could not quite break through. Around him, the dock workers whispered quietly to each other. Someone nearby muttered the word imperial. Someone else said princess. The rumors traveled across the corridor like sparks jumping between wires. Daniel ignored them. He had spent years fixing coolant lines and worn thruster valves on ships from half a dozen systems. And during that time, he had learned a simple rule about life in space. When royalty appeared somewhere they normally did not go, it meant the universe was about to become complicated. The escort formation moved forward, their boots making a faint rhythmic sound against the metal floor. Daniel realized with slow surprise that they were not heading toward the station command office. They were walking directly toward him. He straightened slightly, wiping the last trace of grease from his fingers onto the rag hanging from his belt. The woman stopped only a few feet away. From this distance, the color of her skin was even more striking, a deep ocean blue that seemed almost luminous under the station lights. Her silver hair drifted gently behind her shoulders like a thin stream of starlight, and the golden color of her eyes held a quiet warmth that felt strangely familiar. Daniel searched his memory again. Nothing. Just the vague feeling that he had seen those eyes before somewhere far away and long ago. She studied his face carefully, as if measuring every detail. Not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with the calm curiosity of someone confirming something important. Daniel cleared his throat, suddenly aware that nearly every person in Docking Ring C had stopped working to watch the moment unfold. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, his voice steady even though the situation made absolutely no sense to him. The woman tilted her head slightly, the faintest hint of a smile touching the corner of her lips, as if the question itself amused her. For a few seconds she said nothing. The silence stretched just long enough for Daniel to hear the distant hum of station generators and the quiet clicking of cooling metal from the docked ships behind him. Then she stepped one pace closer. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but clear, carrying easily through the silent docking bay. 10 years ago, she said, a human mechanic landed on a frozen moon nearly 300 miles beyond the outer trade routes. Daniel blinked slowly. The words struck his memory like a small stone hitting still water, sending faint ripples across a part of his past he had not thought about in years. The woman continued watching him carefully, waiting. "That man found someone trapped beneath nearly 2 feet of ice," she said. "Someone he did not know, someone he had no reason to help." Daniel felt the memory finally surface, sharp and cold like the wind that had blown across that distant moon so long ago. And suddenly those golden eyes did not seem unfamiliar at all. The memory arrived all at once, carried on the phantom chill of a wind that had blown across a frozen world far from any shipping lane. Daniel Carter could almost feel the cold again, the kind that slipped through gloves and crept into the bones no matter how good your suit insulation was. 10 years earlier, his small salvage shuttle had touched down on a nameless moon, whose surface temperature barely climbed above -100 degrees Fahrenheit, even during its brief daylight cycle. He had not gone there looking for trouble. He had gone looking for parts. The outer colonies were full of abandoned mining platforms and broken survey drones, and a careful mechanic could sometimes find a fortune hidden beneath a few feet of ice and dust. Daniel remembered stepping out onto the frozen ground with the wind howling across the empty plains and the sky glowing pale blue above the horizon. His suit sensors had warned him the moment he crossed 50 yards from the landing struts. There had been a faint signal buried beneath the ice. At first he assumed it was a damaged transmitter from some forgotten probe, but the signal pulsed in a pattern that looked almost like a heartbeat. Curious, Daniel followed it across the frost-covered surface until he reached a shallow ridge where the ice had formed thick layered plates. He remembered kneeling down and brushing the snow aside with his gloves. The signal grew stronger there. Beneath nearly 2 feet of solid ice, something moved slowly, weakly, as if struggling against sleep. Daniel had stood there for several seconds, debating with himself. Salvage pilots learned quickly that curiosity could be expensive, but leaving something alive under the ice felt worse than the risk of stopping to check. So he had taken out the small thermal cutter from his tool belt and begun carving a careful circle through the frozen surface. It had taken nearly 20 minutes. The wind kept blowing frost back into the cut, while the cutter slowly melted through the thick crystal layers. When the final piece broke free, Daniel had lifted it aside and looked down into a narrow pocket of frozen air beneath the surface. That was when he saw her for the first time. A young alien girl lay curled in the ice chamber, her blue skin pale from the cold, and her silver hair frozen into delicate strands around her shoulders. Her breathing was shallow but steady, small clouds of vapor forming with every exhale. Daniel remembered staring down in quiet disbelief. Even then he knew she was not from any species that normally traveled through that sector. Her clothing was too finely made, the fabric shimmering faintly despite the frost. Someone important had ended up in the worst possible place in the galaxy. The girl had opened her eyes slowly when the warmer air reached her face. Golden eyes. The exact same shade now standing in front of him on Meridian Station. At the time she had looked confused more than afraid, studying the strange human leaning over the edge of the ice pit. Daniel had spoken the first words that came to mind. He had said, "Do not worry, I have got you." He had lowered a thermal blanket into the chamber and carefully helped her out of the ice pocket. She had been light enough that he could guide her toward the shuttle without much effort, though she had remained quiet the entire walk back across the frozen plain. Daniel remembered the way the wind had tugged at her silver hair while she looked around the empty horizon with wide, curious eyes. Back then he never asked who she was. To him, she had simply been someone who needed help on a very cold day. Now, standing in the warm light of Meridian Station, those same golden eyes watched him with calm recognition, as if the past decade had been nothing more than a brief moment passing between two breaths. The memory settled into place with quiet certainty, like a puzzle piece finally finding its corner after years lost in the wrong box. Daniel Carter looked at the tall, blue-skinned woman standing in front of him and felt the cold air of that distant moon echo faintly through his thoughts. 10 years ago, she had been barely able to stand when he guided her up the ramp of his small salvage shuttle. Inside the ship, the air had felt almost tropical compared to the frozen wasteland outside. Daniel remembered sealing the hatch and activating the internal heaters while frost melted slowly from her silver hair. The girl had stood near the cargo bay wall wrapped in the thermal blanket he had given her, watching everything with careful attention. Even then she carried herself with a quiet dignity that did not match someone lost and alone on a frozen moon. Daniel had noticed it immediately. She did not move like a frightened refugee. She moved like someone trained to observe before speaking. The small shuttle cabin smelled faintly of machine oil and recycled air, while the heating vents hummed steadily along the ceiling. Daniel had poured a cup of hot water from the galley dispenser and handed it to her. She had studied the steaming cup for a moment, as if measuring whether the human offering it could be trusted. Eventually she accepted it with slow, deliberate grace. Her hands had trembled slightly from the cold, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. She asked him where they were. Daniel had told her the truth. They were about 300 miles beyond the nearest mapped trade route on a mining moon that most pilots avoided because there was nothing valuable left there. She had listened carefully, her golden eyes reflecting the pale cabin lights as she absorbed every detail. Then she had asked him a question he still remembered clearly. She had asked why he helped her. Daniel had laughed softly at the time, leaning back against the control console while the shuttle engines warmed for departure. To him the answer had been obvious. Because leaving someone buried under 2 feet of ice on a moon where the temperature stayed below -100 degrees Fahrenheit felt wrong. He told her that much. The girl had watched him quietly for several seconds after that. Something about the answer seemed to surprise her. Eventually, she looked away and studied the navigation display glowing above the pilot's seat. The silence that followed had not been uncomfortable. Daniel had seen enough strange things in the outer systems to know that people carried their stories at their own pace. So he never pushed for details. He simply plotted a course toward the nearest refueling outpost nearly 600 miles away and let the shuttle climb slowly into orbit. During the short flight, she spoke very little. But once, as the stars came into view through the cockpit glass, Daniel remembered seeing a faint expression cross her face. Not fear, not relief, something closer to wonder. She had asked what humans called the bright cluster of stars near the horizon. Daniel had told her the name humans used for it, and she had repeated the word softly, as if testing its sound. Now standing again in front of him on Meridian Station a decade later, that same thoughtful expression touched her face for the briefest moment, as if she remembered the stars too. Daniel exhaled slowly, the last trace of uncertainty fading from his mind. The frozen moon. The buried signal. The quiet girl wrapped in a thermal blanket, staring out at the galaxy for the first time from his shuttle window. He knew exactly who she was now. What he still did not understand was why someone who commanded an imperial fleet had come all the way across the stars just to find a mechanic working on docking ring C. Daniel Carter held the woman's gaze as the last pieces of memory settled into place, and for a moment the busy sounds of Meridian Station seemed to fade into a distant hum. 10 years had passed since that frozen moon, yet the recognition between them now felt immediate and unmistakable. The girl he had pulled from beneath 2 feet of ice had grown into someone entirely different, someone who carried the quiet gravity of command in every movement. Yet beneath the silver fabric and the escort of imperial guards, Daniel could still see the same calm curiosity in her golden eyes. He folded the grease rag slowly and tucked it into his belt, buying himself a second to process the impossible situation. "You were the one on the moon," he said at last, his voice steady but thoughtful. The woman's faint smile deepened just enough to confirm the truth without another word. Around them, the docking bay remained unusually quiet. Dock workers pretended to check equipment while clearly watching every second of the exchange. The Imperial escort stood several feet back, silent and composed, allowing the conversation to unfold without interruption. Daniel studied the woman again, noticing details he had missed earlier. The fabric of her attire carried faint patterns that shimmered like starlight across deep water, and a small crest rested at the collar near her shoulder, a symbol shaped like a rising star surrounded by delicate rings. Even without knowing alien politics, Daniel understood what that meant. She was not simply important. She was royalty. He rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully, remembering the quiet girl who had sat in the co-pilot seat of his shuttle while the stars drifted past the cockpit glass. Back then she had asked questions about everything. About human ships, about navigation routes, about the way humans named constellations. Daniel had answered each question casually, never imagining the conversation meant anything more than passing time during a short flight. Now he wondered what she had been thinking during that journey. "I never got your name," he said slowly. The woman's expression softened in a way that made her look briefly like the curious traveler he remembered. "You never asked," she replied gently. The statement was not an accusation. If anything, it carried a note of quiet appreciation. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the truth of that. At the time it had not seemed important. A stranger needed help. That had been enough. The woman took another small step closer, her voice lowering slightly, so only he could hear the next words over the distant hum of station machinery. "My name is Lysera." The name settled into the air between them like the final piece of a long-delayed introduction. Daniel repeated it once under his breath, committing it to memory. Lysera watched him carefully as he spoke the name, and something in her expression suggested she had waited a very long time to hear it said that way. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The station lights reflected across the observation glass behind them, where the enormous fleet still floated silently in orbit. Finally, Daniel glanced past her shoulder toward the massive ships visible through the docking windows. "That is quite an escort for someone looking to say thank you," he said with a small hint of dry humor. Lysera followed his gaze briefly before looking back at him, her golden eyes bright with quiet meaning. "I did not come only to say thank you," she said. Daniel Carter studied Lysera carefully as her words settled into the quiet air between them. The hum of Meridian Station slowly returned to his awareness, the distant clang of cargo clamps locking into place, the faint vibration of passing shuttles drifting through the steel structure of docking ring C. Yet the presence of the enormous fleet outside the station windows made everything feel different, as if the entire outpost had suddenly become the center of something much larger than its usual routine. Daniel folded his arms loosely across his chest and gave her a thoughtful look. "Then why did you come?" he asked. Lysera did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned slightly and glanced toward the wide observation glass that curved along the outer wall of the docking bay. Beyond the transparent barrier, the imperial vessels hovered in perfect stillness, their long hulls reflecting the pale light of the nearby gas giant, nearly 300,000 miles below the station's orbit. The sight carried a quiet power that made even experienced pilots pause when they looked at it. Lysera seemed almost indifferent to the fleet behind her, as if those ships were merely tools rather than symbols of authority. After a moment, she looked back at Daniel. 10 years ago, she said slowly, I learned something I had never seen before. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly, curious. Lysera continued speaking with the calm clarity of someone who had spent a long time thinking about the memory. In my world, every action carries an expectation. Favors create obligations. Aid requires repayment. Kindness is rarely given freely. She paused, studying his reaction. Daniel shrugged faintly. That sounds exhausting. The corner of Lysera's mouth curved with quiet amusement. It often is. She stepped a little closer, lowering her voice so the surrounding crowd could no longer hear every word. When you found me on that frozen moon, you did not ask my rank, my family, or what reward I could offer you. Daniel nodded once. Because I did not know any of those things. Exactly, Lysera said. And yet you helped me anyway. The memory of that cold world flickered again in Daniel's mind. The endless white landscape, the biting wind cutting across the plains, the quiet girl wrapped in a thermal blanket sitting in the passenger seat of his shuttle while the stars drifted across the cockpit glass. At the time it had felt like the simplest decision in the universe. Lysera's golden eyes held his as she spoke again. At first I believed you must have some hidden motive. My tutors had always taught that humans were unpredictable but rarely selfless. Daniel chuckled softly. Your tutors have not met many mechanics. For the first time Lysera allowed a small laugh to escape, a soft sound that carried warmth rather than royal distance. The dock workers watching from a few yards away exchanged surprised glances. Daniel noticed, but ignored them. So what changed your mind? He asked. Lysera looked past him briefly toward the station corridor where travelers and cargo haulers normally moved through the docking ring. The area had grown strangely still as people waited to see what would happen next. When she returned her gaze to Daniel, there was something deeper in her expression, something that had not been there before. When my people finally located me 2 days after you left the outpost, she said quietly, they asked how I survived long enough to be found. Daniel felt a faint tension in his shoulders. And what did you tell them? Lysera met his eyes without hesitation. I told them a human mechanic showed me something our empire had forgotten. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Which was? Lysera answered with calm certainty. That compassion can exist without expectation. For a moment neither of them spoke. The station lights reflected softly across the floor while the distant fleet remained suspended outside like silent guardians of the moment. Then Lysera drew a slow breath. That lesson changed more than my understanding of humans, she said. It changed the course of my life. Daniel Carter watched Lysera in silence after her last words, the weight of them lingering in the air between them like the quiet hum of the station engines. Around them Meridian Station had begun to move again, though cautiously, as if the entire docking ring understood it was witnessing something unusual. Cargo technicians resumed their work more slowly than before, and a pair of shuttle pilots standing near the observation glass pretended to inspect a loading console while clearly listening to every word. Daniel noticed none of it. His attention remained fixed on the tall, blue-skinned woman who had once sat in the passenger seat of his battered salvage shuttle wrapped in a thermal blanket. That is a lot of responsibility to place on one small decision, he said after a moment, his tone thoughtful rather than dismissive. Lysera did not appear offended by the remark. Instead, she nodded slowly as if she had expected the reaction. Perhaps, she replied, but sometimes the smallest moments change the direction of entire lives. She turned slightly and walked a few steps toward the wide observation glass that overlooked the station's outer docking platforms. From there, the enormous Imperial fleet filled the darkness beyond the station hull, their long silver shapes floating in perfect formation against the deep black of space. The blue glow of their energy systems reflected faintly across the glass, casting soft, shifting light across the metal floor. Daniel joined her beside the window. Up close, the scale of the fleet was even more impressive. Each ship stretched nearly a mile from bow to stern, their smooth hulls designed with a grace that suggested both power and precision. Daniel had seen warships before during his years traveling the frontier systems, but nothing on this scale. Your people must be very serious about sending messages, he said quietly. Lysera folded her hands loosely behind her back as she studied the ships outside. In my world, symbols matter, she said. And appearances shape how other civilizations interpret our intentions. Daniel considered that for a second. So what message does bringing a fleet to a small station mechanic send? Lysera turned back toward him with that same calm expression he remembered from years ago. The faint amusement in her golden eyes returned. It tells the galaxy that the man who once saved the life of an unknown traveler is someone the Thalorian Empire now considers important. Daniel blinked once. That sounds like the sort of attention that complicates a quiet life. Lysera's smile widened slightly, though it remained gentle rather than triumphant. You have lived quietly for many years, she said. Perhaps it is time the universe returned some of the kindness you offered it. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck again, unsure whether to laugh or sigh at the statement. He had spent a decade drifting from outpost to outpost doing maintenance work precisely because he preferred a life without political complications. Being noticed by an alien empire was the exact opposite of that plan. You still have not told me why you really came, he said finally. Lysera studied him for a long moment before answering. The docking ring lights reflected softly across her blue skin and silver hair as she spoke. Because 10 years ago you showed me a different way to see the galaxy, she said. And ever since that day, I have wanted to show you something in return. Daniel frowned slightly. What exactly would that be? Lysera glanced toward the waiting airlock that led to the imperial ship connected to the station. When she looked back at him, her voice carried quiet certainty. A future you never expected to have. Daniel Carter stared at Lysera after her last sentence, the words echoing quietly in his mind while the distant glow of the imperial fleet shimmered across the observation glass. A future you never expected to have. That was the kind of sentence that sounded impressive when spoken by royalty, but usually translated into a long list of responsibilities for whoever happened to be standing nearby. Daniel had spent most of his adult life avoiding exactly that kind of complication. He preferred coolant valves, navigation relays, and the comforting predictability of mechanical systems that behave the same way every day. People and politics were far less reliable. He crossed his arms loosely and gave her a thoughtful look. You might be overestimating how exciting my life actually is, he said. Most days I repair docking clamps and replace worn plasma seals. That does not exactly prepare someone for whatever royal surprise you are about to offer. Lysera studied him with quiet patience, clearly amused by his practical skepticism. The station lights reflected softly across her silver hair as she stepped closer to the wide observation window. Outside, the massive warships continued drifting in perfect formation, their engines glowing faintly like distant constellations suspended in the blackness. She gestured toward the fleet with a graceful motion of her hand. When my people found me after that incident, she said, they expected me to return home unchanged. Instead, I began asking questions that had never been asked inside the imperial court. Daniel tilted his head slightly. That sounds dangerous for a royal family. It was considered unusual, Lysera admitted calmly. But curiosity has a way of spreading. She turned toward him again, her golden eyes steady. I asked why our empire had grown so powerful, yet still struggled to understand the species we encountered across the galaxy. I asked why we relied on caution and distance when cooperation might offer something stronger. Daniel gave a faint shrug. Humans ask those questions all the time. Sometimes the answers are messy. Lysera nodded. Exactly. She folded her hands loosely behind her back as she continued. Eventually, I convinced the council to allow a new diplomatic program. A way to build relationships rather than simply observing other civilizations from afar. Daniel's brow lifted slightly as the idea began to take shape in his mind. And somehow that program leads back to a mechanic standing in docking ring C. Lysera's smile returned, warmer now. Because the entire program began with the story of the human who helped a stranger without asking anything in return. Daniel exhaled slowly. You told the council about me. I did more than that, Lysera said. I used that moment as proof that humans possess something our empire had overlooked. Daniel glanced again at the fleet outside before returning his gaze to her. Let me guess, he said. Compassion again. Lysera's expression softened with clear approval. Yes. The word carried a quiet certainty that made it difficult to dismiss. For a few seconds Daniel considered everything she had told him. The frozen moon. The decade that followed. The enormous ships now orbiting the station. Finally he shook his head slowly, half amused and half overwhelmed by the scale of it all. So what exactly does your new diplomatic program need from a mechanic? He asked. Lysera stepped closer until they stood only a few feet apart, her voice lowering slightly, so only he could hear the answer. Not a mechanic, she said gently. A bridge. Daniel frowned. A bridge between what? Lysera held his gaze with calm determination. Between the Thalorian Empire and the human worlds. The words settled heavily in the quiet docking bay while the enormous fleet outside remained perfectly still, waiting for the decision of one very surprised man. Daniel Carter stood quietly after Lysera's final words, the phrase hanging in the air with a weight that felt far heavier than the vast fleet floating outside Meridian Station. A bridge between the Thalorian Empire and the human worlds. He looked past her shoulder again at the mile-long ships suspended in silent formation against the black of space, their engines glowing softly like patient stars. It was the sort of sight that made most people feel small. Daniel felt something else entirely. Confusion, amusement, and a growing suspicion that the universe had decided to play an elaborate joke at his expense. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully and let out a slow breath. You crossed half the galaxy, he said, brought a fleet large enough to block the view of 3 constellations, and landed on a station mechanic's shift just to ask him to represent humanity. Lysera listened calmly, her golden eyes steady as if she had anticipated every part of his reaction. Daniel shook his head once with a faint smile. That sounds like the kind of plan someone would design after reading too many heroic stories. Lysera's expression softened slightly. Perhaps, she said. But the galaxy rarely changes because of emperors or admirals. It changes because of moments that seem ordinary at the time. Daniel glanced at her again, remembering the quiet girl wrapped in a thermal blanket sitting in the passenger seat of his shuttle 10 years earlier, while frost melted slowly from her hair. At the time he had not thought of the moment as important. It had simply felt like the right thing to do. You are giving that day more credit than it deserves, he said. Lysera shook her head gently. No, she replied. I am giving it the exact credit it deserves. The docking ring lights reflected faintly across the polished floor as a cargo shuttle drifted slowly past the observation glass outside, its engines glowing dimly beside the towering imperial ships. Daniel watched it for a moment before speaking again. Let us assume for a second that I even consider something like this, he said carefully. You still have a problem. Lysera tilted her head slightly. And what problem is that? Daniel pointed at himself with a small shrug. I am not a diplomat. I am not a politician. I barely tolerate station administrators, and they only manage a few. 1,000 people. Your empire controls entire star systems. Lysera's faint smile returned, calm and patient. That is precisely why you are the right choice. Daniel frowned. That does not make sense. It does to me, Lysera said. Diplomats speak carefully crafted words. Politicians negotiate for advantage. But 10 years ago a human mechanic showed compassion without calculation. That quality is something my people struggle to understand. Daniel leaned against the railing beside the observation window, studying the fleet again while her explanation settled into his thoughts. The truth was difficult to ignore. For an empire to send a royal convoy across the stars meant they had already decided something important before arriving. Finally he looked back at her. Let me guess, he said quietly. You were never really here to ask. Lysera met his gaze without hesitation, the faint glow of the fleet reflecting in her eyes. No, she said gently. I came to invite you. The difference between the two words seemed small, but Daniel understood immediately that the invitation had already changed the direction of his quiet life. Daniel Carter remained leaning against the railing beside the observation glass, his eyes drifting once more across the enormous fleet waiting beyond the station hull. The ships had not moved an inch since they arrived, hovering with patient silence as if the entire armada understood that its purpose depended on the answer of a single mechanic standing inside Docking Ring C. The thought alone was enough to make him shake his head slightly. 10 years of quiet work had trained him to think in practical terms. Replace what is broken. Tighten what has come loose. Keep systems running so people can live their lives without noticing the machinery beneath their feet. None of that experience prepared a man to become what Lysera had just described. A bridge between civilizations. Daniel exhaled slowly and turned back toward her. Lysera stood calmly a few feet away, her posture relaxed despite the curious crowd that had gathered at a respectful distance. Dock workers, shuttle pilots, and cargo supervisors watched with careful attention while pretending to focus on their normal duties. News traveled quickly on frontier stations, and everyone could already sense that something important was unfolding in front of them. Daniel studied her face again, noticing the quiet confidence there. The same calm curiosity he had seen years ago in the passenger seat of his shuttle had matured into something steadier. Leadership perhaps. Responsibility. Whatever path she had walked since that frozen moon, it had clearly shaped her into someone capable of guiding an empire. He rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully. "You are asking a lot from someone who fixes docking clamps for a living," he said. Lysera did not argue with that. Instead, she nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in his words. "I am asking you to remain exactly the person you already are," she replied. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Most royal invitations involve changing everything about a person's life. Lysera's golden eyes reflected the distant glow of the fleet outside the window. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but the empire does not need another politician repeating careful speeches. It needs someone who understands the simple value of helping a stranger." Daniel let that sink in for a moment. The strange part was that she sounded completely sincere. There was no pressure in her voice, no command disguised as an invitation. Just a calm belief that he could choose a different path if he wished. He glanced again at the enormous ships outside and imagined the scale of what she was proposing. Meetings between species. Diplomatic travel across systems he had never even heard of. Conversations that might shape how billions of people interacted with one another in the future. It felt absurd and strangely meaningful at the same time. Finally, Daniel looked back at her and gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Let us say I agree to at least hear what this future looks like," he said. Lysera's expression brightened just slightly, the first hint of relief appearing in her eyes. "Then the next step is very simple," she replied. Daniel gestured lightly toward the imperial ship connected to the docking airlock. "I assume that ship is part of the explanation." Lysera turned and followed his gaze toward the sleek silver vessel waiting beyond the station door. Its hull reflected the station lights like a polished mirror, elegant and impossibly advanced compared to the battered cargo ships Daniel normally repaired. She looked back at him with a calm, inviting smile. "Yes," she said gently. "It is time you saw where that small act of kindness eventually led." Daniel Carter pushed himself away from the railing slowly, still studying the sleek silver vessel waiting beyond the station airlock. Up close, the ship looked even more impressive than it had through the observation glass. Its hull curved with a smooth elegance that suggested advanced engineering far beyond anything he had worked on before. The surface seemed almost liquid under the station lights, reflecting faint ripples of silver and pale blue energy along its length. Daniel had spent most of his life around spacecraft of one kind or another, yet even he could admit that this vessel carried a level of refinement rarely seen outside the most advanced shipyards in the galaxy. He let out a quiet breath and glanced sideways at Lysera. "I suppose a tour will not hurt anything," he said. Lysera nodded once with calm satisfaction, though she did not rush him toward the airlock the way a commanding officer might have done. Instead, she allowed him the space to move at his own pace, as if she understood that the decision itself carried more weight than the short walk waiting ahead. Daniel appreciated that. He grabbed his old thermos from the maintenance rail, tightened the lid, and clipped it back onto his tool belt out of habit. The simple action felt strangely comforting in a moment that had become anything but ordinary. Behind them, the docking rings slowly returned to motion again. Cargo drones resumed their quiet routes across the floor and technicians pretended to focus on their work, though Daniel could still feel the curious attention following him as he and Lysera began walking toward the sealed airlock. The imperial escorts fell into step several yards behind them, silent and disciplined, careful not to intrude on the conversation unfolding between the two figures at the front. Daniel glanced once over his shoulder at the small crowd that had gathered near the observation glass. Frontier stations thrived on stories, and he suspected this moment would circulate through Meridian Station long before the next supply convoy arrived. "I am going to be the topic of conversation here for the next year," he said quietly. Lysera followed his gaze toward the watching dock workers and smiled faintly. Stories travel faster than ships in places like this, she said. Daniel chuckled under his breath. That explains the rumors I have heard about half the pilots in this sector. They reached the airlock door where the polished ramp from the imperial vessel connected seamlessly with the station's docking port. A soft line of pale blue light traced the edge of the passage, indicating the pressure seal was stable. Daniel paused there for a second, looking down the smooth corridor that led into the waiting ship. The interior lighting glowed gently beyond the threshold, revealing walls formed from the same shimmering material as the hull. It looked less like metal and more like something grown rather than manufactured. Lysera stopped beside him, giving him a moment to take it in. 10 years ago, she said quietly, you offered shelter on a small shuttle barely 30 feet long. Daniel nodded, remembering the cramped cockpit and the rattling engine that had carried them away from that frozen moon. Lysera gestured lightly toward the corridor ahead. Today I offer you a ship capable of crossing entire star systems in a single jump. Daniel smiled slightly at the contrast. That is quite an upgrade. Lysera's golden eyes held a thoughtful warmth as she replied. Consider it the beginning of a much larger journey. Daniel looked down the corridor once more, then stepped forward across the threshold into the imperial vessel, unaware that the quiet choice he had just made would soon echo far beyond Meridian Station and across worlds he had never imagined visiting. Daniel Carter stepped fully into the imperial vessel and immediately felt the subtle difference in atmosphere compared to Meridian Station. The air inside the ship carried a faint clean scent like cold rain and polished metal, and the floor beneath his boots felt perfectly steady despite the enormous mass of the fleet floating in orbit outside. Soft lines of pale blue light traced along the curved walls, guiding the eye forward through a corridor that seemed both spacious and carefully designed for calm movement rather than intimidation. Daniel had spent enough time aboard cargo haulers and salvage rigs to know that most ships felt cramped and practical. This one felt deliberate. Lysera stepped inside, just behind him, as the airlock door closed with a quiet seal. For a moment Daniel simply looked around, taking in the smooth architecture and the subtle hum of advanced systems operating somewhere beyond the walls. This place makes my shuttle look like a toolbox with engines, he said. Lysera's soft laugh echoed gently through the corridor. Your shuttle carried me across a frozen moon and into safety, she replied. I would say that qualifies as impressive engineering. Daniel tilted his head with a small grin. You have not heard the engine when it starts in cold weather. They began walking slowly down the corridor together, the Imperial escorts remaining behind near the airlock as if their duty ended the moment Daniel crossed the threshold. The lighting shifted slightly as they moved deeper into the vessel, growing warmer and more welcoming. Transparent panels along one side of the corridor revealed glimpses of internal chambers filled with holographic displays and softly glowing consoles. Crew members moved calmly between stations, acknowledging Lysera with respectful nods as she passed. None of them seemed surprised to see a human mechanic walking beside their princess. That detail did not escape Daniel's notice. Your crew already knows who I am, he observed. Lysera nodded once. They know the story that began 10 years ago, she said. And they know you are the reason I began building this program. Daniel glanced through one of the transparent panels where a star map stretched across a curved display table, dozens of systems marked with shifting points of light. This ship is the center of that program, he guessed. Lysera slowed her steps and gestured toward the star map chamber. Yes, she confirmed. For the past 4 years this vessel has traveled between worlds gathering knowledge about human colonies and frontier stations. We studied how your people cooperate, trade, solve problems, and support one another even when resources are limited. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You studied us. Carefully, Lysera replied. And the more we observed, the more we realized that your species builds connections in ways our empire never considered. Daniel leaned slightly toward the transparent panel, watching the glowing network of star systems shifting across the display. He could see trade routes stretching like threads between distant colonies, forming a web of cooperation across the map. Lysera stepped closer beside him. What you see there is the result of those studies, she said quietly. A network of opportunities where our empire and your people could work together instead of remaining distant neighbors. Daniel studied the star map for several seconds before turning back to her. And you believe a mechanic from Meridian Station is the right person to help guide that process? Lysera met his gaze calmly, the quiet certainty still present in her golden eyes. I believe the man who helped a stranger on a frozen moon without asking anything in return understands the kind of trust that cooperation requires. Daniel looked once more at the glowing star map and slowly realized the scale of what she was showing him. It was not simply a diplomatic idea. It was the outline of a future that could reshape how two civilizations saw one another. And somehow his small decision from 10 years earlier had become the spark that started it. Daniel Carter stood quietly beside the glowing star map, while the soft hum of the imperial vessel surrounded them like distant wind moving through a calm night. The vast network of lights stretched across the curved display, hundreds of systems connected by thin luminous paths that represented trade routes, travel corridors, and fragile alliances built slowly over decades. For most people, it would have looked like an abstract chart. To Daniel, it looked like a living map of choices, each line representing thousands of small decisions made by ordinary people trying to survive and cooperate in a very large galaxy. He folded his arms loosely and studied the shifting lights for several seconds before speaking. 10 years ago, I thought I was just helping someone get out of the cold, he said quietly. Lysera stood beside him, her golden eyes reflecting the pale glow of the star map. You were, she replied. Daniel nodded slowly. And now that moment somehow leads to fleets, diplomacy, and conversations about the future of two civilizations. He shook his head once with quiet disbelief. That is a strange chain of events. Lysera's expression softened with a warmth that carried both gratitude and quiet pride. History often begins with moments that seem unimportant when they happen, she said. Daniel looked at her again, remembering the frightened but curious traveler he had lifted from beneath the frozen surface of that distant moon. The difference between that memory and the confident leader standing beside him now felt almost surreal. Yet the same thoughtful presence remained in her eyes. You changed more than your own future, she continued gently. You changed mine. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, unsure how to respond to something that large. He had never imagined himself influencing the direction of an empire. Most of his life had been spent repairing equipment so other people could travel safely through space. The idea that such a simple action could ripple outward across systems still felt difficult to accept. Lysera turned her attention back toward the star map and lifted one hand toward a cluster of lights glowing near the center of the display. These systems represent the first regions where cooperation could begin, she explained. Human colonies, frontier stations, research outposts. Places where curiosity and practicality often matter more than politics. Daniel followed her gesture, recognizing several familiar names among the glowing points. Small settlements where independent pilots, engineers, and traders worked together because survival required cooperation. You chose the frontier, he observed. Lysera nodded. Because that is where your people show their true character, she said. Daniel considered that for a moment before allowing a faint smile to appear. You know, he said, most humans would say we are just stubborn. Lysera's quiet laugh carried through the chamber like a warm echo. Stubbornness can be a form of resilience, she replied. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, watching the map slowly rotate across the display. Outside the ship, beyond the hull and the station and the waiting fleet, an entire galaxy continued moving through its endless patterns of stars and possibility. Finally, Daniel let out a calm breath and looked at Lysera once more. If we are really going to build something like this, he said thoughtfully, then it probably starts the same way it did 10 years ago. Lysera tilted her head slightly. And how is that? Daniel gave a small relaxed shrug. One honest conversation at a time. Lysera's golden eyes brightened with quiet satisfaction as she nodded once in agreement. And somewhere beyond the walls of the ship, the enormous fleet waited patiently, ready to carry the beginning of that conversation across the stars.